Welcome to Cyber Survivor. I'm your host, Dan Dotson. And today I'm super excited to be joined with my guest, Phil Englert, who is the VP of Medical Device Security at the Health ISAC. Medical devices are everywhere across our country, helping to provide care in communities and helping us make sure that we're taking care of patients. But there are some vulnerabilities and some issues as it relates to cybersecurity. We're going to dive into those topics today. Welcome to the show, Phil.
Thank you, Dan. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited that you're here as well. I love what the Health ISAC is doing, and certainly medical device security is a hot topic. I want to start with, how did you first get involved in healthcare and cybersecurity and medical device security? How did that become your passion?
So my first job in healthcare was as a field service engineer for Fisher Scientific and Instrumentation Labs. After I got out of the Air Force back in the late 80s. Back then I applied for a job that I knew nothing about, and they said, don't worry about it. Not many people do know about these. So, I got in, I was a field service engineer out in California, working in the Bay Area, lots of laboratories from the IBM Almaden Research Center to UCSF, medical research labs, through dental offices and everywhere in between. And it was really fascinating. I got to work with all kinds of neat technologies. I got to meet people that were doing really innovative things with those technologies. And I just grew to love, what it meant. And as I matured into maintaining biomed equipment, more and more in hospitals and ran biomed programs in hospitals and had that patient care connect, the impact on patients' lives, it just kind of grabs you by the heartstrings and pulls you in and holds you, and I've been there, ever since. I was fascinated by the technology and impressed with what people were accomplishing on day one. And that's still true today. And it's why I'm still here.
Yeah, there's no doubt that the advances in medical technologies has helped bring innovation and care opportunities, patient safety, and all of those things that we enjoy and quite frankly take for granted, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of people realize that these hospital rooms have, 10, 15, 20 devices in there sometimes, helping to provide and coordinate the care for a patient.
Absolutely. And it's quite a spectrum of technology, and that's one of the challenges of the space. There's tympanic thermometers that just measure your skin temperature and tell the doctor whether you might be ill or not, or give an indicator, right up through, PET CTs, which uses a antimatter collision event, to help identify cancers within the body and where it is, and everything in between. On that. And so you're absolutely right. The things we can do with medicine today, the technology, enables us to detect and care for the human condition in a way that has never been possible before. And, we continue to move into personalized healthcare where we can tell by your genomics and proteomics, which medicines your physiology will respond to. So we're not guessing on that anymore. As I said, it's as exciting today as it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, no doubt about that. But in those 30 years, you've also seen the rise in cybersecurity vulnerabilities and issues. Would love to kind of understand your thoughts on how you've seen that, unfold as we've digitized healthcare. We've connected these devices. We're relying on them to deliver care. Certainly the adversaries see that as an entry point. How have you seen that transform over the last number of years?
Yeah, so the connectivity of medical devices was really about how do we deliver better care and how do we deliver better care at scale. So it was, the collecting of the information that these medical devices generated, right? Compiling it into huge data sets, analyzing that, and better understanding human physiology, the human condition, and the treatments that are proven to have better outcomes. So this was led by caregivers, right? And they were really about, let's just share this information information, get it out, a little bit of bragging, this is what we're doing. Can you do better? Can you build upon it? And it's a really collaborative, supportive community across the spectrum, at the care delivery level. But at the same time, we were building these large data sets that, data is worth, can be capitalized, is worth money. And so, that kind of painted a target on our back, unbeknownst to those that were driving the innovation, and the data amalgamation, if you will. So when we realized that, wait a minute, we've got a big problem, we were a little bit behind the 8 ball on that. We had, healthcare networks were flat. They grew organically. They weren't well planned out. Even newer ones, because of the diversity of technology, were really hard to manage. We had, a lot of specialties. And if you think about a hospital, it operates more like a mall of specialty stores. One store sells belts, one store sells pants, one store sells shoes. They all support dressing the human, right? But they function slightly differently. And so those differences in that specialty, didn't lend itself to unified systems. So we developed a lot of diverse technologies. We developed a lot of diverse middleware, if you will, that helped us manage and understand this data and utilize this data. And then we were out there on the network. It wasn't until we began to realize that this could be monetized and held against us. The data privacy rights were still very young. They're still not as mature as they should be. We see, the European Union with GDPR and some of the med device and IVD, regulations that are coming out that are recognizing that there are numerous stakeholders, middlemen, cloud providers that have a stake and a role in this, and they hold them accountable as well as the caregiver themselves. So after we've painted the target on our back, we said, how do we fix this? How do we control it? Med devices is a scary spot, right? But if you think about, the average hospital in the United States generates about 3.7 terabytes of data a day, right? It's a huge amount of data that we're doing, and managing that data is a very difficult thing to do. And that's really what's at risk. Medical devices, because they were designed to be purpose-built for a clinical function, were not necessarily designed with all of the security protocols that we would like them to have in today's hostile environment. And so we manage against that. But we've also got the IoT and the OT devices that also support healthcare delivery, whether it's elevators, air conditioning, access systems, cameras, and monitoring systems that all help us deliver that healthcare to our patients, are also susceptible to these very same sorts of weaknesses. And so we're beginning to bolster this, to use secure design protocols in our design, where the regulatory agencies are getting in front of that and, demanding that we are using up-to-date software, that it's managed, that we understand what the components are, that we're monitoring and correcting those. And we're beginning to see changes. So we're really happy about that. Not as fast as one might hope, but I think we're on the right path and heading in the right direction.
Yeah. So Phil, one of those changes is the Patch Act, right? That got signed at the end of 22. That there's been a lot of conversations around, creating a bill of materials, the SBOM, kind of trying to attack the future problem, if you will, right? For future medical devices. How are you familiar with the Patch Act? Is that something that you follow? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the Patch Act was a necessary event, right? The FDA had, statutory. We're going to fix this, Brian. The FDA had statutory oversight for the safety of medical devices, and we knew that cybersecurity had an impact on safety, but there was a gray area of correlation. The Patch Act gave this FDA statutory authority for cybersecurity in medical devices, and what they really said was, engineering is about making a device do certain things, and cybersecurity is about, preventing unwanted things from happening. And that's really what we're talking about here. So the Patch Act did a couple of things. It gave the FDA statutory authority. It said you must do certain things, including providing SBOMs. SBOMs are a step in the right direction, but they're really an asset management tools. What software components, what hardware components are in my device? And knowing what those components are and then expecting the manufacturers to monitor those components for new and emerging vulnerabilities and respond and provide those responses to their customers is an essential element in maintaining the serviceability of these devices, just as, changing components, whether they're brushes or belts or filters or whatever other kind of normal routine maintenance you do on med devices. So that's really, really important for us to understand. It also gave the FDA the ability to, declare that devices that can't meet today's expectations, will not be brought to market on that. And so I think those were very important for the FDA to have. They were very important for the industry to share. And we've seen, other nations, whether it's Singapore, Taiwan, the European Union, or Brazil, adopt very similar measures. And we see the International Medical Device Regulatory Forum, the IMDRF, also adopt these very same protocols that help do this, and that unification on a global, that harmonization on a global basis is important, not only for healthcare providers, but also for manufacturers to be able to develop devices that are applicable across the broad geographies that they provide equipment for.
Yeah, I think you brought up a bunch of good points there, about the Patch Act, and I think some of the kind of structural challenges that we're faced with the FDA. And I definitely agree with you wholeheartedly. It was a step in the right direction. As a kind of a pragmatic thought that I have is like, there's millions of medical devices active in the US today at all these facilities, thousands of facilities. I've yet to meet a CFO of a health delivery organization that replaces a medical device if it's still operating clinically, right? There's no useful life on these things. You got stuff in there 20 years. As long as it's operating clinically and it's, doing what you need it to do, we keep it in service, right? Because we operate on grocery store margin budgets, but it could be running really unidentified or legacy vulnerable, infrastructure underneath that device. How do we attack that problem? What are you seeing people do in that regard?
So there's lots of strategies, and a single strategy won't solve it all just because of the depth and breadth of technology, right? The underlying infrastructure, of different medical technologies requires a different solution. In some instances, segmentation might be the way. In other instances, because of the interoperability of the devices, segmentation might not be microsegmentation might not be the solution that works for you, and you have to improve the monitoring and then anticipate how these devices can fail, and how do you set up, what is your response plan for that? How do you get the clinical functionality back in service? It was one of the things, my early days as a field service engineer got me thinking about, right? My job was to, go out, diagnose what was wrong with the device and return it to service. And when you're operating there, it's a break fix mentality. When I first got into the IT, the cyber side, they treated it special. They were like, oh, there's vulnerabilities that we can patch or not patch, or we can manage, or we can do mitigating controls. And we had all these solutions, but after studying that for a number of years, I realized that cyber was really a failure mode. It was a way for things not to work or not to work as expected. So as a clinical engineer, it changed the way I thought about things. I asked myself, well, if cyber is a failure mode, how can it make these devices not fail? And how am I going to restore services, right? And so it allowed me to then begin to think about, can I have a hard drive ready so it doesn't take me 2 weeks to rebuild from disk? I can, install a ghosted hard drive, apply the patches and updates, restore my operating configuration and be up and running in, 4 hours instead of 3 days or 2 weeks, and so that allowed us to begin to think about what was it from a maintenance perspective? How do we keep clinicians providing patient care? Because that's really job one. Most medical devices, and I did this for health and public health a few years ago, we looked at the question was if the United States were to lose its geosynchronous timing circuits, how would that impact medical devices? And a study of the broad technologies discovered that most of them could operate independent of network connectivity. Clinical workflows go in the John. They're non-existent, right? But you can still deliver patient care on a one-on-one basis, right? And so that was reassuring the devices, the clinical functionality was robust, to your point earlier. And so, in thinking about that, how do we keep these things running is just as important when we can restore clinical services, continue to maintain, the population trust and provide population care. That's the mission of hospitals at scale, in any community.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, availability is the number one thing as we think about the business that we're in, which is providing, care in these communities. And we have to make sure that they have the available tools that are appropriate, medical devices, EHRs, all the things, elevators, to your point, lights, anything that might be connected. They've got to have that so that they can provide care in these communities. And having availability is certainly the number one. And recovering, if to your point, if there is an issue. So what type of work are you doing at the Health ISAC around medical device security?
So, the Health ISAC is the only group that I'm aware of that brings manufacturers and healthcare providers together to talk about the problems that we have about this. And it's great because each side begins to understand the constraints, the guardrails, the limitations that the other side has, also what their focus is, right? When you're a manufacturer and you're looking to limit the risk to your organization, that's a different risk than the healthcare provider and the risks that they have in providing care. So, we bring organizations together. We've got, the Medical Device Security Council. We've got 3 chapters. We're a global organization. Health ISAC is made up of over 1,100 organizations globally. And we like to say we've got 22,000 members working for you. And the thing is, whether, 46% of healthcare organizations or Health ISAC organizations are healthcare delivery organizations. If we think about hospitals in the United States, there's about 6,000 of them, according to the American Hospital Association. But when I look at the HHS, accountable care organizations or covered entities, and we start counting all of the, dental offices, physicians' offices, physical therapy centers, mental health centers, independent caregivers, independent pharmacies, you're looking at well over 350,000 different covered entities. So most of healthcare is provided by small independent care delivery organizations on that. And so leveraging the knowledge, the experience, the expertise of large organizations to the benefit of our smallest members, is really where the maximum value is gained through Health ISAC membership. The exposure, the relationships, building friendships, and then having, experts that you can call on that know who you are, that have enjoyed social events or had meals with you, at one of our summits or at one of our workshops, is a really powerful tool and really, one of the greatest benefits that any member will tell you exists.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And look, collaboration is critical for us to, overcome our adversaries, right? They're collaborating. I love what you guys are doing. Take us into that room. I mean, you've got some pretty, competing structural challenges between, for-profit manufacturing of devices. You've got, grocery store margin operating budgets on the health delivery organizations, or and that's for the ones at scale. You've got, greater than 50% of some of these hospitals are operating in the red. Capital in cash is a challenge, which means you have legacy devices. You've got manufacturers, like there's a notion of like who's responsible for this, where does the responsibility lie? I'm sure you're involved in a lot of intense conversations. Take us into that room. What are some of the things you guys are talking about?
So here's a couple of work streams that I'll describe that we're currently working on, and these are all member led, which is what I love about it. I just bring this talent into a room, and we talk about a task and we go after it. But one of them is, what our medical device security metrics look like, and how do those metrics differ when I'm telling my story to manufacturing leadership? And how do those security metrics differ when I'm talking to my product development teams? And how do we do that? So we've got different manufacturers coming in, sharing their expertise, their sources of where they get the metrics from, the stories that they're able to tell with those metrics, how effective they were, how they were received, whether they were successful, and what they were able to do with them. Another one is a group of manufacturers came to us and said, hey, HDOs are all over the board as far as what kind of controls are desired. And it's interesting because manufacturers try to build devices that will operate in any networked environment with any sort of variables that go along with that, and requirements. And, hospitals want stuff that's built specifically for them and not have all of those wide open doors. So we've got a dichotomous view of the world here, and we spend a lot of time, talking about or arguing about solutions and not agreeing upon requirements, and so one of the things that we're doing is going back. We've surveyed our HDO members, our manufacturing members, and said, hey, from a control perspective, what are the controls that you think are most important? And we broke it down into two levels, for those medical devices that have a full operating system that operate on, laptops and PCs or servers, as opposed to those devices that have embedded operating systems and have really limited interfaces, compute resources, and things like that. Well, how do those controls look different? And we're going to come up with, a group of about 10 controls that will, describe what it is for those kinds of technologies, so that manufacturers can focus in an informed way on what their customers are looking for. And their customers will also be able to understand, and as the products mature, be able to modify those, to say, hey, we're pretty good at at authorization. Now let's focus on encryption or some other control on that. So by leaning into our membership, understanding what their real life experiences are, and then sharing that back amongst each other, is a powerful tool. We'll hope, that at the end of the day, it will reduce the amount of effort required to do risk assessments on inbound medical devices. It'll better help us understand how we can control the risks that these medical devices are introducing into our networked environment, and build a more resilient healthcare system, not just for medical devices, but for all of the purpose-built devices, IoT and OT included, right? And then ultimately where we're going to end up is these will be better partnerships where we're back to a position of trust around the security of medical devices, that buyers will be able to, have confidence that the device that they buy will do what they need it to do. And as you described, over time, because they're built to be robust and accurate and have a long life, that over time they will trust that the manufacturer will continue to support that device, and enable that secure and effective and efficient operation, well into the future.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like I said, I love that. When you think about the risks medical devices present, are you more worried about an adversary like taking over control of the device, or using the device to get to somewhere else in the network, or to get the data off the device? what do you think about from a risk profile, like is the concern to the patient?
So what we've seen, and I think if you look at the breaches, what is real is the exposure of the medical data, right? And it's not so much, nobody is really interested in what my blood pressure or my pulse or my temperature is, right? But can they get other data that they can then monetize, right? And that's the real thing. So far, we have not seen, or maybe perhaps we've just not recognized that a device has been manipulated to change the performance or the operating characteristics of it. Intuitively, we know that that's possible, but right now, criminals are following the money. Why do bank robbers rob banks? And I think that perhaps it's time to relook at, is paying the ransom the right thing to do, right? Do we recover any faster? Could we take those resources and apply them to recovery and restore, operations much faster, and get back to the business of taking care of patients and quit rewarding, by paying the criminals for their behavior. And I think if we take the reward away, they will look for another reward. Maybe it's a different industry, perhaps not. Maybe we just get better at securing the front end or detecting, malfeasance within our own networks and are able to reduce, the risk and exposure of our data, of our patients, of our safety.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, listen, you bring up a really interesting and complex topic. I mean, when you're faced with a ransomware and you have a decision to make and you're hard down and you can't deliver care in that community, you're in a tough spot, right? And if you hadn't made the right investments prior to that situation, you may not have a whole lot of options, right? If you want to get, care back.
So one of the challenges, and I was just talking with one of our members, and he shared a thing that I believe he said that there was a 14% increase in spending for IT security and healthcare, and yet ransomware went up by, ransom events went up by like 69%, some astronomical number. So the target is there. Taking the reward away from the criminal element will change the criminal direction, if you will, and that's really a policy piece. I think health data governance, has to become a national security concern. If you look at China, health data is a national security issue, and we treat it differently because of our, let's say, our caring, our sharing, willing, and openness in the United States. I think we're stuck between, wanting to do good and wanting to protect ourselves.
Like in the middle of an actual ransomware, though, I mean, is the decision really about the exposure of the data, or is it getting back to be able to providing care?
So I think there's two elements, right? And you have to understand where it is. First, understand, has your data really been leaked? Is it as big as it really is, right? Getting back to care delivery is super important, right? Because it's been demonstrated, doctors Christian Demeth and Dr. Jeff Tully at the UC San Diego, right, did the study when a local hospital was breached. It overflows to all the surrounding hospitals with increased patient flows and increased demands on care that affects, patient outcomes and changes lives. And so that's really the element there. And I think I think we're in a role where we're willing to pay, but there's been many models, and I will point to, the NHS in Great Britain that has been ransomed several times in the past few years, and they don't pay. They do have to pay for the restoration of services and data systems, right? But they don't pay ransom by that. They get ransomed, at magnitudes far fewer than it happens in the United States, right? And they're still getting back to, delivering. So paying the ransom does not necessarily enable the restoration of services. I think healthcare has made great strides in that front. We are better protected, we're better backed up, we have better restoration plans for the most part. And I think that's proving, well off. And that discussion of to pay or not to pay, is always a lively debate amongst our members.
Yeah, listen, I have found myself in those discussions. I recognize the complexity of that. I do also agree with you that Jeff and that team out there have done a great job looking at all different angles of multiple scenarios. One of which is as you mentioned, kind of the impact, the blast radius, on facilities that may not be directly but are indirectly impact in a cyber incident. So they've done great work out there. We've actually had Jeff on the podcast. I'm a huge fan of what they're doing.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So, look, I think it's about sharing information, Phil, and about trying to figure out how we learn from each other and how we take every event that happens and share it to the best of our abilities without getting anybody in legal trouble, which is a different topic and a different challenge, but it's important so that we can learn from each other and become more resilient, as an industry. So certainly agree with that.
Very good. Yeah, there's a lot going on. I'll tell you, I was just out at UC San Diego last fall, and it was a pretty eye-opening element. Our digital dependence, it was kind of revealing. But they had a patient on a table that was showing on the monitor that they were having an arrhythmia. Their heart rate was different than what it actually was on the physiology. And the anesthesiologist, took the pulse with their fingers, right, and believed the monitor before they believed their own input, their own body, on that. And so we've created this digital dependence. We all do it with our banks. When I was growing up, I knew everybody's phone number. Now I can't, remember my wife's without looking at my phone, and so what we know, where data is stored, how we use data changes what we have. And so I think from a healthcare perspective, we have to recognize that we do have that digital dependency. We have to recognize that human care, while there is population health management, human care is a one-to-one event, right? And we should have plans in place to, if we don't have a ventilator, that we have a breathing bag. If we don't have a defibrillator, we can provide CPR. There are manual ways to do that. And I think as we move more and more into this digital dependence, it's important for us to stop and exercise the manual muscle memory so that we can, in cases of emergency, revert back and, continue to provide services, in if not an optimal condition, at least a compromised condition that will, carry us through and allow us to continue to do job one.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I've talked to lots of different individuals on this podcast and otherwise that have been impacted during an event, and just even simple things like being able to do the math, for prescriptions, right, and for medication rec and that kind of stuff. I mean, that's real live stuff. And, and not to mention that all of this isn't medical device related, but a lot of the clinicians, both physicians and nurses, PAs, et cetera, that are now coming out of school, Phil, they don't know anything about care delivery without computers, right? I mean, they don't know how to do, they haven't been trained. They've never worked in an environment where they don't have an EHR and all the other medical devices feeding it that are working, at scale on time. And so you're absolutely right. It becomes a big challenge.
It's interesting because I'm old enough that I was in the transition from paper charting to the electronic health records and lived through all of the challenges that had. And, when EHRs first came out, they were unreliable and nurses were reverting to charting, on a regular basis, sometimes several times a day, and over the years, it was pointed out to me that you hit a generational point where you've got, generations now of nurses that have never charted on paper, and, plan B is go to a bin, pull out the papers and the clipboards and the pens and start writing it down. And I was at a cybersecurity training symposium for healthcare. And that was one of the key points that was made is you just can't put the plan in place. You actually have to exercise it with those that are going to be expected to carry it out. So when they pull out the clipboard, they know which hand to pick the pen up and how to write things down. And then how do we get that data into the systems again, on the back end?
Yeah. Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what else are you working on at the Health ISAC? Anything else that you want to share?
So a couple of things, Health, as I mentioned before, Health ISAC's a global organization. We've got 3 chapters of our Medical Device Security Council. I've got a European chapter, an APAC or a Western Pacific chapter, as well as the Americas chapter. And, serving a global geography is tough to do. So bringing groups together, but it's very interesting what their focus is on. Obviously the EU is worried about the MDR and the IVDR, and elements like that. How is that going to change pieces like that? We're concerned about AI. And how does that change medical devices? Everybody is slipping AI in, and, if you think about it, medical devices, if you go back to, the mid 70s when we had computer aided detection for mammography scans, that was really AI where they were recognizing, tumors, in breast tissue well before AI was even a coined phrase on that. So how is that going to change what we're doing, and how is that going to impact, what we can do? The speed at which adversaries might be able to leverage AI, is going to have to be matched by the speed in which we can detect and protect against, false and erroneous data on the front end. The other element that we see, and I think this is an even bigger, it's a population health issue, right, is the hospital at home or the digital hospital, right? The current care scenario, the current care model of a pill hill, and we've got a centralized acute care center, and that's where care takes place, is not sustainable. We have an aging population, serviced by a shrinking, caregiver population. So bringing care to where the patients are is not just a strategic imperative. It's a social must that happens. The technology that we're developing, right, is going to be phenomenal in what we can do, what we can monitor. One of the hardest things in healthcare is to maintain compliance with care once you leave the acute care center. Are you taking your medication? Are you, changing your bandages? Are you getting up and walking every 20 minutes or once an hour? Things like that. We now have the technology, whether it's wearables, implantables, or otherwise, that can, prompt those patients, can inform caregivers, of care compliance. It's going to be a force multiplier, allow, caregivers to monitor larger populations with much less effort. And I look forward to that, but that is not without risk. We're now leaving, what might be a hostile healthcare environment into the wild west of, population health. The FDA said you cannot rely on human behavior. The FDA said you could not rely on human behavior as a control point. This is what they've directed manufacturers to, meaning that I can't count on my patient to update their phone and keep their phone up to date, right? If it happens, that's great, but that shouldn't be reliable. I should have a method to recognize that risk and compensate for that risk and apply, patches and mitigations as appropriate for the risk that my technology is introducing to the care environment. And those are all very important concepts that get more and more complex not just geographically, as as we try to continue care in rural settings, but culturally across different propensities to accept care or accept help, even, and elements like that, or cultures or languages. And so that's going to be very difficult. I think it's one of the opportunities that Health ISAC really has as a global organization, is to recognize that, we're beginning initiatives to, translate documents, resources into different languages that will enable folks to read and gain resources, in what they're comfortable with, and not, English as a second language, which may or may not lose something in translation, but we should certainly treat them, as if they're as important as all the rest.
Yeah, no doubt. So Phil, I got one last question for you. Do you think we're more secure today than we were when you started your leadership and your involvement in medical device security?
I do. Well, we have to go back to when I started, right? So when I started, the cardiac PAC system was a server that wasn't connected, to anything but the monitor on the cardiologist's desks, right? The physiological monitoring systems all ended in the equipment closet at the end of that department hallway. They weren't connected to a central system, right? So from that regard, I think, we're probably more exposed, but I think in the past few years, what I've seen is a concerted effort to understand, where weaknesses are within the healthcare infrastructure, a concerted effort to partner with our suppliers, whether they're the medical equipment suppliers, the middleware suppliers, the cloud providers, to help understand that. And I think we're really beginning to work more cohesively. We Health ISAC just had a tabletop exercise where we brought a healthcare provider together with a medical device manufacturer, and we put a challenge in place about, this event took place on this kind of equipment, and what were the expectations, what were the actions that the healthcare provider would do, and what was the response of the medical equipment manufacturer, right? And were they aligned? Were they working towards the same things? Because previously they were driven by different goals, different outcomes on that. And surprisingly, it was very eye-opening, and we look forward to doing many, many more of those in the future, to bring that. We brought the water ISAC together into our hobby exercise and did a tabletop exercise looking at, healthcare and water. So what happens if the water supply is, compromised and it has to be rationed? Are we giving it to manufacturing? Are we giving it to healthcare? How much water does healthcare use? How much water does manufacturing use? And beginning to think even across sectors. So I think we're looking at it more strategically. We're looking at it more interoperability and less in silos, which are going to make us more resilient. We're having better conversations. And so I'd say at the end of the day, yes, we're more resilient today. I can't say that we're more secure because I'm not sure that I fully understand that from an IT perspective, but I think we're more resilient. I think we're more able to protect ourselves. I think we're better able to detect, and I know that we're better able to respond.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Phil, for leading these conversations and for all the work that you're contributing with the Health ISAC. And obviously, you're doing a great job helping to bring these communities together to strengthen us against our adversaries. So appreciate that very much.
You bet. Well, Don, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this was great. And thank you so much. I'm Dan Dotson, and this is Cyber Survivor.